who is the greatest among you. Let him be servant of all. Welcome again to another broadcast of Building Great Leaders. We are going to continue the series we began on living with God-given restraints. We tried to lay the foundation in our last session on what God had in mind when Adam was created and how he put the guidelines to protect Adam and protect Eve as they came along, to protect them to walk in the realm of obedience. But God used the aspect of restraint to help Adam and Eve to stay in a position of being protected. And I believe when we get in our minds that God has given mom and dad and God has given authorities within the church ministry and authorities within lives who become authorities over us in life are there really for our protection and the orderliness of how we should live our lives. I'm going to follow through now on the chart that we started, where we had our first point. One of the restraints is the restraint of society. Now let's look back at our chart here, and we look at the restraint of society. We said one of the big restraints of society would be a speed limit. There would be, when you're constructing buildings, you are under the guidelines of the state fire marshal, you're under the guidelines of people who are basically looking for our safety. Romans 13 says these were put in there not to be a terror to good works, but to be a terror to evil works. Now, what happens in society when those who were put there to be a terror to evil works become a terror to good works? And I believe we're going to begin to see more and more and more of that as our society goes into absolute rebellion against God, absolute rebellion against any authority structure that God has given, and where man makes himself his own God and will make himself his own boss, so to speak, and will listen to no authority at all and make himself his own God. And that's what was promised by Satan. You shall be as gods. And God has no rule over this person. God has no rule over my body. And I'm going to do what I want to do in life. But in this context, I'm talking about those who are put there to be a terror to evil works and a helper of good works. Particularly in this realm would be the realm of our safety. Now let's look at the next ring in, and I think young people would be able to look at this, and that's the aspect of peers. And peer pressure is not like it used to be. I worked for many, many years in a teen leadership camp for well over 40 years. And one of the things we would always discover in those interviews, in those early days, and I'm going back into the 70s and then into some of the early 80s, there was a big issue with peer pressure. Young people would get into things and, well, what happened? Well, did you submit to peer pressure? Yes, I did submit to peer pressure. But that is not such an issue anymore. But 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33 says that evil company corrupts good morals. So we do have to keep in mind that wrong friendships can become very devastating to a person's life. And in a way, that puts a kind of a pressure on us that we have to say yes or no. And if pressure is coming on me from peers, then I have to look at that and say, God, is that limiting me from obeying you? Or is the pressure from peers the thing that is helping me to a Godward life? I remember, I think it was a Georgia quarterback several years ago was asked a question. You're a Christian. You have a testimony. You're in a locker room. How do you overcome the peer pressure that you face? He said, I am peer pressure. In other words, I don't submit to peer pressure. I am peer pressure. I make my own peer pressure. I don't submit to that pressure because I have my own life. And realizing when you look at that, evil communications corrupt good morals. You look at the danger of having the friends. Now we find Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. And when you look at that tragic story in the Old Testament of Amnon, there was a pressure from peers there that caused a terrible, terrible scenario down the line in David's family life. And he received bad counsel and bad pressure from peers in that category. So young people today, for the most part, and maybe it's because so many things have changed with technology, so many things have changed in how people communicate and how they communicate on emails and all of that. There's not as much time together with the peers that you had before, and you don't have so many pressures coming from that direction. But yet there is that aspect of peer pressure that comes in. And then you have another aspect, and that is from church. And you have a God-given restraint. Just the preaching of the word puts my flesh under restraint. My flesh would love to have an expression of itself, and yet when I get into the house of God, I'm commanded, first of all, not to forsake my gathering together with people. I am not to voluntarily keep myself from being in fellowship with God's people. And so there is a restraint in that way, a restraint to my freedom and limits my ability to call myself totally free. I get under the preaching of the word. There is a restraint of the word. There is the conviction of the Holy Spirit that comes in. And it's a very, very healthy thing when I find that when the sermon is preached and the pastor gets up and preaches on the Great Commission. And I want to live my own life. I don't want to give myself to world outreach. I don't want to give myself to missions. I don't want to give myself to be available to give the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, outermost parts of the world. And so I hear the message that pastor preaches on Great Commission, and I find myself being tested. And am I being restrained by the truth, restrained by the preaching of the word, so that I cannot have the freedom in my own soul to do the very thing that perhaps I would choose to do, that I want to do with my own life. And tithing maybe is preached, or grace giving is preached. And a young person just starts getting his first income as a teenager from his lawn business. Or he's just getting his job at Wendy's, or just getting paid from his job working for a landscaper. And he gets his first paycheck, and the question he hears the pastor say, all of it is God's. But at least 10% of it should be given to the work. Not from an Old Testament law standpoint, but as a common sense, since God owns all of it, 10% is a good place to begin the giving. And my, how many in that state have learned right from their first paycheck or their right cash payment that they receive, that they get that amount of money put into God's work as a life model. Maybe it's only $5. Maybe it's $15. But it's the beginning of a life pattern that makes God the first one to receive God's work, the first one to receive from the income that I receive. Maybe there's a command that there are needy people in the community. But whatever that is that I get in the church, and I hear the word preached, and I see the fellowship of believers, and I am obeying the command to not forsake myself together, there is a certain restraint to that of your freedoms that you'd say, well, I'd rather have my Sundays to myself. I'd rather have those free to myself. So that becomes a pattern that is there. So you have the God-given restraint, as we pointed, of society. We pointed that out. We had the God-given restraint of peers, friendships that are putting proper peer pressure, or that could turn into a negative peer pressure. Then we have the church that is there. But now we get to another one, and that is the school. When we get to school, and then we ask ourselves the question, what is going to be the guideline that is given there? I used to like to use an example. Parents see a young person. They have always been an obedient child. They've always gotten in the car when they were told. They always went on vacation when they got in the car when they went. Now they hit 12 years old. And the parents begin to sense that there is some independent thinking starting here. And the mother goes to the pastor, says, Pastor, I need to talk to you. I think my child is demon-possessed. Say, Pastor says, what? You mean Billy? Yeah. What makes you think that? He looks weird. What do you mean he looks weird? I tell him to do something, and he doesn't look right at me. And something is wrong. And Pastor said, how old is Billy? He's 12. He's getting ready to turn 13. Said, well, honey, relax. That's not demon possession. It's adolescence. They look very similar in outward characteristics. 2 weeks later, Billy comes to see the pastor. Said, Pastor, I don't breathe a word, but I think my mother's possessed. Why do you think that? She looks weird. She doesn't know who she is at times. She said, don't forget who I am. I am your mother. And Billy says, I think maybe she's losing it already as young as she is. And no, Billy, she's not possessed. She has become the mother of an adolescent. And of course, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but just relax. You're both going to survive this. But the mother does say this, I know right now we need to get that child into a Christian school. So what happens is she gets Billy in the car, drive him to the school in the summertime, and gets an appointment with the principal. And the principal said, so you want to come to school here? Out of the desk comes what's called a handbook. And guess what's in that handbook? God-given restraints that are under the authority of that school. And all of a sudden, the freedom that Billy has been experiencing, what he's wearing in the summertime, how he chooses to appear in a physical appearance, suddenly he begins to feel this pressure that he never felt from society, and that he didn't feel from peers, that he didn't feel from church, but now that ring is getting in a little tighter. The ring is squeezing in a little bit tighter. And now we, for the first time, see Billy beginning to really squirm and almost develop an attitude that I don't think I am going to like that setting at all. Why? Because for the first time in his life, perhaps, he is going to be told that there are some guidelines that he's never had to follow before. And we see that aspect of submission beginning to come in. And I know so many parents who come home from that first school meeting and they're told some rule about denim, and they're told some rule about what you can do and cannot do. And the mother said, we just went shopping and we bought all these clothes This child is just in third grade. You mean he can't, what's he can do when he gets on the playground with these clothes that are not denim and so on. Of course, again, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I have lived long enough and been involved in Christian education long enough, from helping to start the school, Christian school, K through 12 in Michigan, and all of the parents, and having been parents with 4 kids going through Christian school, that you just get deals, you just get bargains. Kohl's had a deal on these things. Now the kids can't wear them to school. Well, that's a little bit of pressure that begins to come in, and it's not a big deal, but it is a restraint that has not been there before. And then we get to the parent. Now, the parent puts a great deal of pressure, especially when the child begins to get a little bit older, and says, Mom and Dad, the school is going to be doing so-and-so, and the school is going somewhere, and mother says, or dad says, over my dead body. Well, the whole Christian school is participating. If they all walked off a cliff, would you? And the boy at that time is thinking, maybe I would at this point. I'm not sure. But what's happening now is the testing that comes, and the parents say, I don't care what. This is what is going to happen in your life, and they're not going to tell what's going to happen in our life. So now you have a little bit of a, that's why when we had our Christian school, I told our pastor, I said, Pastor, you know what? If we're not careful, we're going to let natives overtake the compound. And I said, because parents are sending their kids, and they don't really have an understanding of what our purpose is here as a Christian school. Parents are enrolling their kids to get a good education, but I don't know that they understand our overall purpose as an institution. I said, when we sign those parents up in the fall, I told Pastor Rhodes, I said, let's sign them up. They have to take a 3-hour class, parent class. If you enroll your child, you enroll in this 3-hour class under the staff. And so we did that. Pastor said, that's a good idea. So we set this up when they enrolled their children. They said you have to agree to enroll for this 3 hours on a Friday night under the church and school staff. And Pastor Rhodes and I basically handled that time. And some of the fur began to fly. I got into our first parent meeting, and one of the dads of a student came to me in the hallway and said, I will sue you. And Pastor Rhodes is standing there. I said, Pastor, do you get what I'm saying now? This guy is a parent of one of our students, and he's threatening to sue us because we want to help them. And after those 3 hours, that dad came and said, I am so sorry. He said, I had no idea this was going to be so rich and so helpful. Please forgive me for my blowing up. Well, what happened is if the parents don't get a point of what's going on, of what that Christian institution is trying to do, then all you're doing is allowing natives to come in and gradually overtake the compound. And so you keep your purpose in mind, and we went through theological statements of why we're there, what we're doing, how we plan to be a tremendous help to the parent. And boy, what a difference it made. What a huge atmosphere difference that made. And so we get to the parent now. The greatest pressure needs to come from right here, from self. When I look, I need to be putting myself and dying to myself. Because here is God, here is the cross. And if I put myself there in that middle circle, I don't feel pressure. The Apostle Paul never felt pressure from man's standard. Never. Why? Because Paul says, I die daily. 1 Corinthians 15:31. Galatians 2:20. God forbid, or I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ that liveth in me. I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So here we have Galatians 2:20, Galatians 6:14. I am crucified with Christ. Then he says, God forbid that I should glory in anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. When they had Paul in chains in prison, Paul was free because he had already died to himself, dying daily, identifying with the death of Christ, identifying with the cross of Christ. And when he looked at these aspects of it, Romans 12:1 and 2, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercy of God, that ye present yourself a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so when an individual puts himself there, where Paul put himself daily, you're never pressured by man's standard. When you put on yourself a higher standard than man does, you're never pressured by man's standard. When I went to college, I did 1 year in a dorm before we got married because I went to school a little older. People asked me, said, why would you go to a school like that had so many rules? I said, what rules? Well, you wake up, 650 feet on the floor, and they had these kind of things about alcohol and these sort of, and I said, I guess I'm not aware of those. School had a 650, and this goes way back to the 60s, but the college had a 650 wake-up time where my standard was 5:30. Because I used to be on the road driving to work already at 6 o'clock before I went to college. So I used to go up to the prayer room in the dorm there at 5:30 in the morning. So I guess I wasn't aware of that standard. I guess I'd imposed on myself a greater standard than that institution did, so I wasn't aware of that guideline. Alcohol, that was never a part of my thinking. And so on, and you get those kind of ideas, and there's nothing legalistic about this. It's just life. And so when you look at that, here's where the issues come when we start to live our lives. The issue comes, how am I going to view myself in light of the cause of Christ and in light of the cross of Christ? If I want no part of that, I really have no part of discipleship. Because what are the commands of God here? When I put Jesus Christ in his place and I identify with his cross, Luke chapter 14, we find that Jesus talked to his disciples, those who were following in great company. And it says in verse 25 of Luke 14, and there went a great multitude with him, and he turned and said unto them, and this word turn there is a whirled quickly, and said unto them, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. I remember in camps I used to preach this. I said, no, here's what you need to do. When you get home from camp, mom and dad ask you, what did you learn at camp? And say, well, I learned to hate you like I've never hated you before. I said, no, that is not the idea here. That word meseo is a term of comparison. If any man come to me and hate not. In other words, if he gives priority, preferential treatment to father, mother, than to me. And therefore, if he comes and he does not, and he shows favor to his parents, his family, to his friends, and yea, in his own life also. And I call that his favorite. In other words, if I choose to live my life, I'm going to please me. I'm going to please my way. I'm going to have my life. God says you cannot be my disciple. It's not that you didn't go forward at camp to be one. You can't be. Because you're not walking in the line of discipleship. Verse 27, and whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. 3 statements. He cannot be. You cannot be my disciple. So I need to love him supremely above everything else. And I need to make him Lord of my life in every area and take up the cross and follow. God says you can't be my disciple. And then he says, for which of you intending to build a tower sits not down first? In other words, give long contemplative thinking in counting the cost, whether you have sufficient to finish it. Or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulteth whether he with 10,000 shall meet those coming to him with 20,000. Long, serious consideration. So becoming a disciple steps up long, serious consideration. And then last of all, not only must he be supremely loved, he must be Lord of my life. Thirdly, he must be willing to leave all. Verse 30, so likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath cannot be my disciple. So, do I put myself here? Or am I still fighting these battles of restraints? Or have I died to self to put myself where the cross is? And love him supremely. Make him Lord of my life. And by the grace of God, I will leave everything to follow him. God said, if not, you can't be my disciple. Boy, that's hard. Tough demands. But nonetheless, that's what the Word of God says. And so I have to be willing to identify with Christ. I should be the biggest pressure in my life. My own commitments to Christ should put me under the greatest restraints because I love him supremely. I want him to be Lord, and I'm willing to leave all to follow if that's what's necessary. Luke 14, study it carefully. God, help these lessons to be imprinted in our minds and hearts. God, may we love you, walk with you, obey you, serve you with every ounce of our being. God, we know we're in flesh. We know that we are weak. But yet you are the great enabler. Thank you for the model that was set by Paul, the price that was paid on the cross for our sin by Christ. And may we commit to follow wholly. In Jesus' name, amen.